Welcome everybody who is just joining. We will give the normal couple of minutes or so for people to virtually arrive. I think we've got over 100 people signed up today, and based on past numbers, that means we should have a good 60 or so people actually joining us. Up to nearly 50 now, lots of familiar faces. It's good to see everyone here again today. Thank you for taking the time. I think you should automatically be muted, but if you could make sure you stay on mute, that would be great. And do feel free to have your camera on or off. I actually quite like looking at an array of faces. It's quite nice to feel you're talking to people and not just a blank screen. We will be getting underway in a few moments. If you are able to change your name to your name and your organisation name, then that helps with identifying who's here and helps get a sense of who else is in the room. If you could keep yourself on mute unless you're invited to unmute yourself. And as you probably know, I think you should have had a warning on the way in that the webinar is being recorded so that we can share it via our YouTube channel after the event. And finally, there is, of course, a chat box. Please do just say hello, comment, ask questions. There should be a time for discussion and question and answers towards the end of the webinar. Thank you very much, everyone, for taking the time this afternoon. We are looking today at charity infrastructure and specifically the step change model, which I'm sure will be very familiar to many of you in Oxfordshire. We are very proud at OCF that we are the administrators and supporters of the fund and help them and support them in dispersing funds to local organisations. Much more on that to follow. To kick off, a few slides by way of background around charity infrastructure. What does it mean exactly? I mean, infrastructure is a sort of big word. We think about roads and vehicles and public transport, but what does it mean in relation to charities? Well, there are some, what I think of as sort of boring but important things around good governance, around safeguarding and whistleblowing. And we will all have seen in the news examples of where governance doesn't work effectively, such as Kids Company, and that ends up in, you know, pretty disastrous situation for that organisation and a lot of the recipients of their services. We've seen examples of where insufficient funding is put into important areas like safeguarding with Oxfam and the Haiti scandal. And that's not to criticise Oxfam. They're under huge pressure from donors to keep core costs down. But if you don't invest in those areas, then things can go wrong. But there's also much brighter side to charity infrastructure in terms of future potential. And we all know, you know, spend our lives with our noses to the grindstone. Having that time and capacity to stand up, look around, think a bit, do the strategic planning and thinking, think about the new ideas and identifying which ones have got potential, training and development of staff and the team, looking at, you know, income generating activities that your organization could develop. These are all things that make our organization stronger and more future looking and more able to provide good services to people. And that's the kind of areas that Step Change is very interested in investing in for the future. Next slide, please. Charities Aid Foundation recently published a report which is well worth a read. I haven't read it all yet myself, but focusing on charity resilience, particularly coming out of the pandemic. And we all know that there has been a phenomenal community response over the last 18 months. But we also know that, and OCF is part of this, most of the funding that comes out is focused on providing services and activities focused on communities and supporting communities. And we will probably all know of organisations who have been doing incredibly good work, largely through the efforts of volunteers who are now trying to think through what they can do in a sustainable long-term way. And whilst good volunteers can take you a long way, if some good volunteers stop doing that work, it can be very hard to replace them. So thinking about paid staff coming into those organisations is going to be critical in terms of long-term capacity and impact for those organisations as we come out of the pandemic. And I think the quote there kind of encapsulates that, businesses recognise the need to invest in their organisations' capability and capacity. Charities and funders sometimes fail to recognise the importance of that. Next slide, please. So what is step change? The ultimate ambition of step change is to strengthen good quality, proven local organisations and enable them to do more. They provide a mixture of funding and support to those organisations and have had massive success over the last 7 years or so that they've been working. And there's an array of statistics there, but I think the two at the top, if you can't quite read them because the print is quite small, 80% of key performance indicators identified through the support of step change have been achieved out of the end of that. And I think possibly more significantly, 61% of the charities supported have seen an increase in their turnover out of the other side. And turnover is not an exact measure of impact for charities, but it's a measure of size and scale and a pretty good approximator for how much impact those charities are likely to be having. So we've seen a lot of success. The needs that step change is based on. Next slide, please. One example here is the Gatehouse, and I'll just give you a moment to read that slide for yourselves. And it'll be a familiar picture to many of you, a recognition that systems are out of date, need updating. And if you're able to do so effectively, it's going to save a lot of staff time and capacity that could be better used, focused on outputs for service users. So it's that sort of need for updating, need for change, need for strengthening of systems is often at the heart of what step change are trying to achieve. Next slide, please. And I think the next slide sort of picks up on some of the themes highlighted in the first slide in terms of, training, income generation, strategic shifts for organisations that are at the heart of what step change looks to support for organisations locally. And through our website, there is a list of organisations who've been supported, or download a report of organisations who've been supported by step change. And if you read down that list, it's just an amazing bunch of organisations who have been helped to step up, to make more of a difference and have more of an impact in their local areas. And it really is a good array of organisations. And I'm sure that the names on that list will continue to grow and continue to impress in the future. Right, so on to our speakers for today. We have Sara Fernandez, who is CEO Oxford Hub, who will be known to many of you. She's also recently, earlier on this year, joined the board of Oxfordshire Community Foundation and wears a number of other hats besides. And Oxford Hub have been a recipient of a grant from Step Change. So she will be talking about her perspective in a number of different ways shortly. After that, we have another Step Change grant recipient, Ruth Madder from Bridewell Organic Gardens, who will be talking about the work they've done and the difference the Step Change grant has made to them and support. And then finally, we'll be hearing from Sandy Arbuthnot, who is chair of Step Change, the Step Change panel, and a donor to Step Change, talking about what has motivated him to support through Step Change locally. And then, of course, we will have time for a Q&A session at the end, which I'm sure will be lively and engaging. So without further ado, let me hand over to Sara to talk about charity infrastructure and its importance.
Hi everyone, let me share my screen, which hopefully everyone can see. So I am here today as a local charity CEO. I work at Oxford Hub, which is a place-based charity working to tackle inequality and build relationships in Oxford City. So as Adrian said, we have received support from Step Change in the past. I think it was maybe in 2013 or 14, so a long time ago. And it enabled us to invest in our charity infrastructure to grow a bit more sustainably by investing in digital development. So we were able to scale up without having to grow our staff team in a big way by updating our systems. So today I want to talk a little bit about charity resilience and how we define this. And this is some thinking that I remember doing with Oxfordshire Community Foundation just as the pandemic started 18 months ago. So we were meeting as a team, as a group of local charity chief execs about the emergency philanthropy response and the need that there was. So yes, there was a very urgent need, but there was also a bigger question, which was, what would it take to recover stronger? And that is all about building resilience in charities and in the sector. And that is what the Recover Stronger funding from OCF also enabled us to do. So this idea of charity resilience is something that I have been thinking a lot about over the pandemic, as the voluntary sector has played a key role in the emergency response. Obviously, we did it for Oxford City, but it was loads of other people who did it across loads of different sectors and locations. And there are three things that I found useful to use as a guiding principle for Oxford Hub to be a resilient charity. But also I think these are three things that are very important for the sector as a whole to focus on collectively. So these three things are efficiency, collaboration, and inclusion. So firstly, efficiency. As the voluntary sector, we are increasingly playing a more active role in communities, not just at the grassroots, not just as the nice to have, but also taking on significant contracts from local authorities, working closely with the statutory partners, and delivering really important services across communities. So in this context, it's really important for us to play very efficiently in the system. So we have to have a lot of information at our fingertips. We need to have really good quality delivery, and we need to be able to have oversight over a lot of these while delivering value for money. So like a lot of things are expected of the voluntary sector. Beyond this delivery, we also want to and need to play a role in challenging the system. So as a social impact organization, often it's not enough to just deliver on a contract, but we want to also influence the system. I was hearing from a local CEO yesterday who was talking about the necessary changes that we need to do for supported accommodation. So obviously they are delivering a service, people are accessing supported accommodation, and that needs to be delivered well, but also the organization needs to find the time to also, while delivering the service, also advocate for changes that would make it a fairer service for everyone. And so from a social justice perspective, we're trying to do so much. We need strong infrastructure to deliver efficiently, but we also need to find the capacity and the time to advocate for the bigger change. And that is what Adrian was talking about earlier in terms of like, how do we find this space? How do we find the time to really advocate for that bigger change? And increasing our efficiency is a good way of freeing up that time to do that. The second aspect is collaboration. So as a sector, we often see the landscape from the perspective of our own organizational boundaries and structure. However, if you are a person who needs help, these boundaries are really artificial. They really don't matter. It's not about our legal setup. It's not about who holds the contract or what service level agreement and what it says about who is going to take responsibility for what. From a social justice point of view, if we want to serve people better, we need to see it from the person's perspective and collaborate across organizational boundaries. So we need to do the right thing for the person, for the human in front of us. And that often involves being creative around connecting with partners and having much deeper and more meaningful collaboration. And that is a key aspect of how do we become more resilient as charities, but how do we become more resilient as a sector so that we can serve people better. And then finally, but perhaps the most important of all of these things is actually inclusion. So I think we need to acknowledge and recognize that our sector remains white and middle class, and that is not okay. So unless we work to represent a plurality of voices and communities, we really won't be able to effectively meet everyone's needs. So at the heart of charity resilience is a really important transition for all of us to challenge our current levels of representations and build more inclusive organizations. And this is something that we all need to keep in mind as we work internally with our teams and with the sector. So I think we probably can all agree on these three things. We need to be more efficient, we need to be more collaborative, and we need to be more inclusive. But actually, what are the enablers to be able to achieve this? And that is a harder question. So for us, at Oxford Hub, it's definitely been having really good charity infrastructure and having the funding to deliver on that charity infrastructure. And in particularly, it's been three aspects. So the first one is we have had a big investment in digital development. Our digital strategy has been evolving since 2012, 2013, and we have learned a lot along the way, including learning a lot about how not to do things. And it has certainly been a challenging journey. And I know from talking to other CEOs in the sector that digital is often daunting, it's often complicated, and is a hard thing to implement well. So we have been working over the past 18 months a lot to take on this learning and to continue on our digital journey and improve, basically invest more in digital. So we have been working with Oxford Code Lab, which is a local social enterprise that is focused on social impact work with charities and public services. And this has really enabled us to multiply the reach of our work without having to proportionately multiply the reach, the staff team, which actually could have never been afforded because we know resources are constrained. So you cannot just grow and employ more and more staff. And digital is a good way of figuring out ways in which your staff team can add more value in the things that matter more rather than on the paperwork, as the Gatehouse quote earlier was highlighting too. So the second enabler for us has been learning much more about GDPR and data and how to share things with partners. And I think the pandemic provided a really good opportunity to overcome that feeling of, I couldn't possibly work with you because of GDPR, which is perhaps an excuse that is no longer valid, no longer an excuse. We need to improve our ability to understand data so that we can share information, referrals, and support across organizations. And a really strong charity infrastructure can help with that. And the final enabler for us has just been having a little bit more time, in part created by digital efficiencies and partly created by emergency funding and more enlightened infrastructure funding to really focus on inclusive employment. So for a lot of organizations, when you are really up against it and you just have to deliver, it's really hard to say, actually, how do I become more inclusive in my employment practices? We really had this luxury in some ways to have a little bit more space to think about inclusive employment, and we have published a lot of our approach online to share with other organizations. It's definitely resulted in a much more diverse staff team at Oxford Hub. We have been able to welcome people who have direct experience of the issues that we're working to tackle, and we have become a very different organization as a result, and that is something that, while I wouldn't call a finished project, is something that we are really proud of, and we would like to encourage everyone to spend the time and the headspace doing. So in all of this, it's really important to recognize the role that funders play in enabling these sorts of investments, because you need to create the spaces for charities to improve their resilience and infrastructure, but that's not actually that easy to fund through the usual donors and the usual funding sources that are available, which means that it is hard for the sector and a strange incentive, because obviously everyone in the philanthropic world wants to see stronger and more resilient charities. Now, as Adrian said earlier, I have become a trustee of the Community Foundation, and I also spend a lot of time engaged in the ideas of what philanthropy could look like in the future. So let me find you this. This is something that I would like to share with everyone, which is a little bit of a new take on what modern grant making could look like and what grant making reform could look like. And I like to see it as an opportunity to, as a philanthropic sector, think about how do we build more of the step change type of funds and more of the infrastructure and space type of funds, and how can we continue to develop the ideas that we have so far. So in particular, I see it as not just what funders can fund in terms of step change, saying we can fund infrastructure, but also how funders choose to fund organizations so that they can meaningfully find this space and invest in these areas. So this book is really, really good. It tackles some of these how principles and how you can do grant making in a way that Yeah, it provides the space for organizations to achieve those principles of charity resilience we were talking about. I'd like to highlight two things that, I mean, you can read the whole book, I think is worth a read. The first thing, it talks a lot about trust-based processes. So I think it's important that we recognize that what we are trying to do a lot of the time is not trial and tested, particularly when it comes to digital innovation or when it comes to some approaches to inclusion. It's hard to put KPIs towards things that haven't been done before. So, for example, when we started developing the process of blind recruitment and inclusive recruitment at Oxford Hub, we couldn't really find anyone taking a similar approach. So we wouldn't have been able to put a hard number against different objectives. We were testing an approach, and that trust-based approach to funding becomes really, really important. Now, a trust-based funding approach moves away from traditional monitoring towards a focus on learning. So if you're moving from monitoring to learning, it's actually a very hard transition. Learning involves spending time reflecting on things, improving things, and ideally sharing that learning beyond your own organization. And this process of learning actually needs funding and support in itself. So I think what modern grant making looks like is also about how funders can do that and think about funding learning capacity as part of their support. So obviously step change is one of these opportunities that begins to take some of the principles of modern grant making, and it is definitely a funding stream that can help create the space to improve that efficiency, that collaboration, and our ability to be more inclusive. So I think I'm now handing over to Adrian and Ruth to actually talk about their experiences of investing in charity infrastructure through step change.
Thank you, Sarah. And yeah, I mean, modern grant making is a really interesting, thought-provoking read if you're involved in grant making or relatively new to it, as I am. So yes, Ruth Bridewell, if you would like to unmute yourself, do you want to start by kicking off by just saying who you are and introducing your organisation briefly?
Thanks, Adrian. I'm Director of Bridewell Gardens, a mental health recovery charity based outside Witney, so between North Lee and Finstock in rural West Oxfordshire. And we've been delivering a mental health recovery service here for nearly 30 years. So working specifically with adults who have experienced serious and long-term mental health problems and helping people to return to more active roles in their community, whether that's getting back into work or taking up volunteering opportunity or other social activities.
Great, thank you. And as we've seen with Gatehouse and other examples, step change funding is often kind of focused on a problem that needs solving. So what was the problem that led you to apply to step change?
Actually, a few of the things that both yourself, Adrian, and Sarah mentioned already have reminded me what it looked like when I joined Bridewell. We had a track record of delivering a really successful service. We knew that what we were doing worked, but everyone was so busy that all of our resources, very limited resources, were focused on doing that as best as we possibly could. When you lift your head up, take your nose away from the grindstone, you realise that was despite the infrastructure around us. So anyone who's been to our site here that we absolutely love and are very, very proud of, up until a few months ago, we had no electricity, we had no internet, we had very, very ageing physical infrastructure around us, so roofs that were leaking, a kitchen that was in desperate need of refurbishment, really essential infrastructure that people would take for granted. We were also divided, our team were divided over a hired office space and then the support team who are working here on the ground at the gardens. So we were realising that a lot of time and money in our core activities were being not used as efficiently as they should be if only we were able to address some of that core infrastructure.
Great. And so what difference did the step change funding and support make then?
So it immediately has saved us money. We're obviously many of us working from home, but we no longer need a hired office space. We don't need to hire storage away from the gardens. And that's been able to go partly immediately saved, but some of it redirected and repurposed into staff and volunteer training. And then we've also got measurable time back. So particularly for some of the roles that you're daily speaking and sharing time, we're not commuting between two sites, moving service user notes, physical notes between two sites, also able to work more efficiently now that we have access to the internet and electricity on site. But those were benefits that we outlined when we applied for the Step Change Fund, and that we're reporting on now. But actually the other benefits that I hadn't seen, probably should have foreseen, are just the momentum and the energy that's come from being able to deliver those really essential changes on site. So it's allowed as a team and as a board, so support workers and our board, to be able to lift our eyes up a little more and think about what next. So our ambitions for the future, how we make our site more accessible to different types of people, what else we could be doing to make sure that we're delivering impact into the future, looking much further ahead than just the next 12, 18 months. That momentum is something that we never described in our in the Step Change initial proposal, but that we're starting to realise now.
Fantastic. So unforeseen benefits as well as what you planned, which is really great. And obviously there is a process around this. And how did you find the process of applying, and how's the process now of reporting back on what you've done?
So applying for something like Step Change is not something that Bridewell had done regularly before. So it definitely felt daunting to try and put forward a request for a significant grant. But the expression of interest and that initial phone or email conversation with OCF was really transparent and very light touch. So I found that very easy as an organisation. That was not onerous, and we were also able to be completely open about what it is we're trying to achieve. Are we going to be appropriate, suitable for what Step Change is interested in funding? We also had a charity health check through OCBA, which again just helps, I think, as a board and for myself as well. It gives you a lot of confidence that we're in a good place to be able to make this kind of investment. Putting forward the detailed bid and being assigned a project manager, that's more involved, but it gives you a lot of confidence that the project that you're describing is well scoped, that you're in a good position to be able to deliver it, and that the Community Foundation and Step Change understand what it is that you're trying to achieve. So you, before you're even presenting that detailed bid, you're very confident about its worthiness and whether those benefits are realistic or not.
Great. And you mentioned OCVA and Charity Mentors, who, for those who don't know, are out there and available to provide support to charities. But you also mentioned the project manager, which is specific to Step Change, in that they don't just provide money, they provide this project management support as well. So could you tell us a bit more about how that role and how that worked?
Yeah, that was a role that we're completely new to, and I hadn't seen that in other grant opportunities. But the project manager was assigned to us after the expression of interest, and they spent time with us. It's Neil Murrock, I think he's on this webinar. Neil visited Bridewell. He sat with me and talked through what it was that we were trying to achieve, and really helped translate Step Change's priorities, what they knew had worked for organisations in the past, reasons why projects may or may not be successful in terms of delivering the change that they're trying to achieve. So helped us to really scope our project in quite a lot of detail, and gave a lot of support around being able to present it in a coherent and cogent way.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ruth. A really important work you're doing, and really great to hear your insights and the difference that Step Change has made to you. So for our next speaker, can I ask Sandy to unmute yourself? And just first, Sandy, I just want to say a huge thank you on behalf of the sector to Step Change and the donors and all the support you've provided over the years. We've heard a couple of examples there of the difference it's made, and that is just so crucial. So do you want to just introduce yourself quickly, and then we'll get on with the questions? Sandy.
Yeah, hi, so I'm Sandy Arbuthnot. I've been a donor to Step Change, I think, for 5 or 6 years now. And a bit over a year ago, really at the start of lockdown, I took over as chairing the grants panel. So, but I think my my main reason for being here today is to talk from the donor's perspective, isn't it, Adrian?
It is indeed. So, and what originally attracted you to Step Change as a donor?
Well, I think, living in the privileged leafy glades of North Oxford, it took a little time to dawn on the need and the less fortunate in the county. And my wife and I had been thinking about how we could make donations, both at Oxford and in London, in fact. And our charity interest was always around social need and social change. So I always jokingly say, we're not really interested in supporting donkeys or cultural activities. And that fitted very much with Step Change's thrust, that where Step Change is interested in organizations that are making social change happen and benefiting people, unfortunate people. So that was the main thing. So it was addressing a need that we would like to support, but also its very mechanism meant that there were people on the panel and associated with OCF as well, who knew the county much better than we did. So in terms of finding good causes to support, this was a much more efficient way of doing it than going out on our own and trying to find good causes. And I suppose you may wish to talk more about it later, but the sheer rigor of the Step Change process, which may be a little daunting to some people, as a one-time businessman myself, that really appealed. I felt that, this was applying the sort of disciplines I'd been used to through my working life to the charitable sector.
Well, yeah, you're leading into the next question, which is about the importance of the process and what you think the benefits are of that rigorous process you mentioned.
Yeah, just before I do that, I think one of the other great things for a donor in the Step Change model is the feedback to the donors, which is given by the Step Change panel. There's an annual review which is published, which is a very thorough and detailed, with OCF's very good support. We produce that every year, very transparent. After every panel meeting, the donors are emailed with a summary of the panel decisions, those grants that have been made and those things that have not been supported. So it's very clear the way we're thinking and the way we're distributing funds. And finally, some of you, I think one or two of you were at our annual dinner last week. So every year we have an annual dinner with guest speakers when we thank particularly our project managers and our donors. So there's a sort of feedback loop to the donors. It's not just a one-way street. So in terms of the actual process, I think, what we're trying to look for first and foremost, or Step Change is looking for good charities. And really the driving thing about that is that they are well led. So quality of leadership, strong leadership of charities is a key criteria. So that's one of the things the panel always looks for. I should mention that we're looking for medium-sized charities here, in the sense that we're making quite sizable grants. And if the charity is too small, those grants might be a little indigestible for a small charity. And obviously, if the charity is too big, they might just be a drop in the ocean compared with their other funding. So we do look for medium-sized charities, and there are plenty of candidates in the county. And in terms of the approach, I think it's been alluded to earlier, we have this two-stage approach. So there's even after the first approach to OCF, the charity will send us an expression of interest where they outline what they are thinking to do with the grant. If the panel likes that, we then invite them to come back in person to present the details and the financial details, and particularly the KPIs. What will be the outcomes of this money being spent? And this is where it links back to a sort of business experience. This is just like an investment proposal at the commercial board. We're saying we spend the money today for the following benefits in the future. And that's what that second and most important panel meeting wants to hear, that the charity has got measurable benefits that will come from the grant. The project managers have been mentioned, and they are absolutely key. I think they are an innovation that is probably close to unique in the sector. So as was said earlier, between the EOI being approved and the final grant application, the charity will have the benefit of working with the project manager, who's always an experienced either in the charity sector or in business, and can help them prepare the application and basically get their thinking clear as to what they're trying to achieve. And finally, and not least, we release the funds, the panel releases the funds on the advice of the project manager against agreed milestones. So this isn't a single check that's written. As the project progresses, the funds are released in a number of tranches. So all those things, I think, make the step change model rigorous and I hope very compelling, particularly to donors who may have come from a business background.
Thank you, Sandy. And there's a lot there, which I think, having come from a charity background, but increasingly engaged with businessmen and philanthropists, a slightly different way of thinking about things in terms of investment, in terms of, you know, the kind of growth potential and investment plans, rather than the sort of grant funding propositions that we're more used to in the charitable sector. That's important to learn on from more widely. So thank you. And do we have any questions coming up in the chat or that we want to pick up, Kate?
Yes, so one perhaps relatively brief one. Siobhan wonders how OCF and step change measures the size, small, medium or large in terms of charity size. If anybody wants to answer that, or I could just give the step change definition.
I was going to say, I'm looking at the website at the moment, so I can answer that.
Yeah, go on then.
The step change focuses on between 75 and 750,000 a year annual turnover for organisations in terms of their funding. So it's not a exact science in terms of small, medium, large, but that's where they like to focus.
Another question. Lucy wanted to know, what did you apply for exactly and what did you receive? A bit more detail about what sort of thing the grant funded.
Thanks, Kate. We applied for a grant to install solar panels and a photovoltaic system to re-roof 2 parts of our buildings and to install a new office on site. So the grant was over £71,000. We had additional funding as well, actually, that supported that, another grant. One thing I should mention was, although that was above what step change say as a maximum grant, the very helpful conversation I had very early on with OCF was, describe what it is you're doing and how much it actually costs. Don't try and fit your project to what the criteria are. And then, that I found that obviously it was very helpful. We weren't necessarily expecting to be successful, but instead of trying to make up a project that fitted the criteria, was to be encouraged to be completely open and transparent. So that was an unusual conversation to have with a funder.
Thank you.
Yeah, another question as well, and I wonder if we could actually, I know that Neil, who is the project manager, Neil Morrick, who's the project manager for Ruth's step change grant for Bridewell, is I think on the webinar. So there was a question about, could you tell us a bit more about what it involves to be a project manager? What is that role, and what do you actually do as a project manager? I wonder if Neil would mind just speaking briefly about that, if we could hear from him.
Okay.
Hi, Neil.
Okay, well, I'll try not to repeat what everyone else has said in very excellent detail. But just let me just say, there are nearly 16 project managers We have a very diverse background, and we're assigned based on history, that is, any knowledge we might have of what the charity actually does. On geography, in other words, Oxfordshire is a big county, so location is important. And finally, chemistry. Obviously, those who assign us try and pick people that will fit with the chair and the chief executive of the charity. So there's a mutuality there, because with that, we start the trust. What I would like to say is that the term project manager could be misled. We manage the project on behalf of the Step Change Fund and the panel. So we act for the fund, but we work with the charity. The charity actually runs the project, usually the director or chief executive, with the board, obviously, and we provide all the tools and the monitoring to help them succeed in this. So our role is not particularly as mentor, but to use the tools that Step Change Fund have developed over the years to make them successful. And if I could just say, Bridewell was a particularly rewarding assignment for me. We had excellent working relationships, they had a good management process, and they had performance outcomes against a very challenging environment. But beyond what we do as project managers, and we get a tremendous kick out of success, and we also are there for the difficult problems as well, means that it has a cathartic effect across the whole organization, because people begin to look at projects differently, how to fund them differently, and how to deliver results, sometimes without funding. Hopefully that's helpful, Kate.
Fantastic. Thank you, Neil. There's a few detailed questions coming up, which I don't know, Sandy, if you're best placed to answer, but the first I can see is, are you overwhelmed with applicants, or would you welcome publicity to encourage more applicants? Now, clearly, we're giving you a fair bit of publicity here today, but do you want to answer that question? I think you're muted at the moment, Sandy.
Yeah, no, I think we're not overwhelmed with applicants. I mean, it's come and gone, and so typically we're looking at 4 or 5 maybe EOIs at a panel meeting and 2 or 3 full bids. That's manageable for us. No, we would welcome more applications, undoubtedly, because the more we get, the more we can be sure that we've picked the best possible candidates for our grants.
Yeah. And just for those who didn't catch it earlier, the starting point is a conversation with Annette in my team, who's worked with Step Change for many years and has a very good feel for what they're looking for, and so is a very useful first touchstone in terms of a conversation. The second quick question was, do KPIs need to be financially based, or is there scope for learning and experimenting?
Well, I can try that one. I don't think they need to be financially based, but I think my understanding of a KPI needs to be quantifiable. So just saying everyone in the organization felt happier after the grant was handed over doesn't quite cut it. So some form of quantification about what we mean by progress, because the whole point is the step change. The organization should look and feel different following the grant. That's the litmus test.
Yeah.
And therefore, I think it's helpful to try and think, how one measures that improvement. And it quite often will be in a number of beneficiaries reached, but it may be other things. But I think quantifiable, but not necessarily financial.
Great. And then the final quick question was, do you fund people resources, human resources, as well as physical infrastructure?
Yep, we do. We yeah, in fact, I think on your slides earlier, you were you almost passed over the physical infrastructure. And in fact, Bridewell was a clear example of physical infrastructure. We do finance employment of new people. I think that's on one of the slides, actually, the number of organizations where we've actually put somebody in. I mean, one of the issues in my mind about doing that is we're only doing it for a finite period, maybe 1 year, maybe 2. So the charity then has to convince us how it's sustainable going forward. We're not expecting them to come back every year and wanting the same person funded. So they've got to explain how financing a recruitment for 1 or 2 years will be the end of it, and that person will be financed within the organisation going forward.
Great. And I know you have had successful repeat applicants, but it's for a very different project each time, I understand.
Sorry, Adrian, I slightly missed that.
Sorry, I was just saying, I know some organisations can come back for a second tranche of funding. It has to be for a different project.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We've done a number of repeat grants to the same organisation, but I think that comes back to the main point. We love supporting top quality organisations, but we're supporting projects, not a general pot for the organisation.
Great, thank you. Now, there was a question for Sarah on blind recruitment. I don't know if you want to just post the link to your resources in the chat box, Sarah.
I will do that, and I will offer to anyone who wants to talk about blind recruitment, please get in touch with me, because I feel very passionate about it, both for trustees and for staff, and I will post a link. It has not been officially launched yet, but you can have it. I'll put it here.
Thank you. Now, John Hayes, I think you're on the call. Do you want to say something about the health check and possible benefits of that? Because I believe that's open to people more widely than just step change.
Yeah, we do a health check for organisations for step change. I guess the idea of that is it's not a sort of rigorous vetting. It's to give step change an idea around how efficiently maybe a charity or actually social enterprises as well are run. So it gives them an idea about who's in charge. And I guess the big thing for step change is not just evidence of leadership, but the depth of that and the depth of the buy-in. So is it just trustees, or is it just the staff? Is this a random grant? You know what it's like. If there's a grant if there's a grant scheme open, people will apply. So I guess the health check helps to cut out those groups which are just applying for the sake of it because they've found the fund, it's open, we're going to apply. And it also, it's a very odd thing because step change is almost a unique funding scheme for me. You've got the managers in there, you've got Annette talking to people to make sure they've got a project that fits it. Then they'll talk to us about a health check and we'll almost run through the organisation and look not necessarily at efficiency, but appetite, if that makes sense, and whether that appetite exists in the organisation. And at that stage, we actually get a lot of people who back out and then think about coming back maybe the next round or the round after that, because they understand they might need to have stronger strategic planning in place, or maybe they need to look at their policies, or they need to actually focus on what they're applying for because it's not detailed enough. So it's a very odd process because it's the only fund that I know of that does this. And also the managers is in there, the grant managers. That's unusual. It is a unique grant in that those donors have almost a personal relationship with the people they're giving the money to. And I guess our function is to help them weed out the ones that they won't want to invest with. And part of that is doing the health check, which looks at how well structured an organisation is and the depth and breadth of leadership, whether it's just coming only from staff or whether the trustees and everyone has built into that planning process. And I'd just like to say around capital, it's actually quite unusual for capital projects to get funded in my experience, But if they're really well structured and it's clear that they're going to make a difference, then they do get funded. I'm going to mute myself now because I'm waffling.
Thank you, John. That's really
helpful. If you've got any further questions, please ask.
Do reach out to John. Usha, you've posted a comment or a question in the chat box, which I think is a really, really important one. Do you want to unmute yourself and say it in your own words?
Yeah, I posted a link before that to the Belly Initiative's book sub-paper, which looks at issues around structural racism in funding organisations and funding setups. And one of the points they highlight is that a lot of Black-led groups survive on project-based funding, and particularly some of the quite astounding organisations that have sprung up or expanded during the pandemic. So I suppose I'm interested because Step Change focuses on the medium-sized organisations that already have that infrastructure in place, and yet we're all aware of this, this discrepancy, particularly within Oxford, between groups that get funding and groups that don't, and the very low percentage of funding that goes to Black and working class-led groups. Whether there is any proactive strategy that you might be looking at, or maybe some other part of OCF is looking at, to help support those groups with the shift from project-based funding to, infrastructure boosting funding and support with strategic planning and some of those things that they won't have had time for because they're too busy delivering.
Thank you, Usha. Yeah, I mean, this is something that I'm really passionate about. We've featured, the BAME Infrastructure Group, Banbury Mosque and other organisations, Oxford Community Action, on our webinars in the past. And I know, as many people around here do, the incredible work some of these organisations have been doing through the pandemic, but on the back of huge volunteer effort, and how those organisations get from there to being sustainable in the longer term is something we are actively talking about and looking at in OCF, and would be very happy. I'll be very happy to talk to anyone who's interested in that area in any way, about who's got any ideas or thoughts to share. Sandy, I don't know if you want to respond to that as well, or if you just want
to. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a question for us, almost handing it back to OCF, Adrian, and say, please bring us projects from underserved parts of the community. I think we'll then look at them, obviously very sympathetically, but as objectively as we would any other project once they've arrived. But we can only look at those that come through the door, is the basic message.
So, yeah, I mean, there's a link to my Calendly diary will be posted in the chat box in due course, and all you need to do is click on that and you can book a half-hour slot to talk to me if you are interested in that or anything else we've been discussing today. Are there any final questions or comments?
We've just had one which slightly relates to the last point, really, but does the rigour put off some of the newer organisations, and does this have an effect on the diversity of the grants made? So I think Ruth talked about being daunted by the process, and I wonder if she could say a bit more about the benefits of it for organisations applying.
Thanks, Kate. It was certainly an unusual process for Bridewell to go through. So in that sense, we've got no experience of it, but we're in a very different organisation, in a different level of maturity to some of the more grassroots organisations that Usha might be referring to. So we do have policies in place. We do have good governance with our trustees. We hadn't necessarily had it presented outwards to a funder in this way before. Or reviewed in even at that light touch health check way that John was talking about, but we had quite a lot of that the policies, procedures and governance structure in place just hadn't been looked at externally before. But I think things like charity mentors, as well as some of the sort of small charity CEO Facebook groups, those kinds of things are where you can do some of that sense checking for free, and before getting involved in something like Step Change.
Fantastic, thank you, Ruth. And just to reiterate that the starting point for the step change process is a conversation with Annette, who is the most warm, friendly, unthreatening, unscary person you could meet. So, and I think her Calendly link has been posted in the chat box as well. So, if you're thinking you might be interested in step change, click on the link, book a session with Annette, and you can have an initial conversation. And you might not be there, but you might be thereabouts. So, there's a lot of support through the process. So I think that's one of the great things about it.
Adrian, just before we finish, Annette did want me to point out that applicants to step change do need to be 3 years old to apply. So in relation to that question, but I think asking the team for support, if you are one of those organisations, they are so knowledgeable and can signpost you to other resources as well, not just step change. There's a huge amount of charity infrastructure support, some of which has already been mentioned, and that we will send you in our follow-up email to this webinar.
And we are, looking at that as a broader issue, because we know there are organisations who aren't 3 years old who do need some transition support to get to a sustainable future. And we're very, very keen to provide that support. Thank you, everybody, for turning out again on what's been another really interesting session. Thank you to our speakers, Sarah, Ruth and Sandy, and also to the other contributions we've had. We're going to be taking a break next month. Doing these on a monthly basis is quite a high demand on the team, but we aren't going away, and we'll be back in at the end of November, looking at the impact of the pandemic on young people, young adults in particular, and coming out the other side. And we all know anecdotally and some of the evidence out there in terms of the mental health impacts, the impacts on well-being the pandemic's had on people at what is, one of the most sociable times of your life. So do come back then, and don't think that because we're not here in October, we won't be back in November. I look forward to seeing you all then, and maybe, who knows, in person in the meantime. Thank you very much, everyone.